Could World of Warcraft have yearly expansions? Well, you know what, it's actually something that Blizzard have expressed a desire in doing, but come on guys, let's be honest, look at the previous expansions, they've clearly missed the bloody mark. We're a year into Siege of Orgrimmar nearly. I think Dragon's Soul was 11 months long, they just keep on ballsing it up every time. So in this video I'm going to dissect a whole bunch of potential issues and points, and essentially draft up a little mini plan as to how it could work. But before we get into that, just one little thing. You know guys, we have been having one expansion's worth of content for the last while, just that we have been paying an extra year subscription fee because, you know, a year of Siege of Orgrimmar. So I suppose, yeah, that's it, we already get an expansion a year. Welp, video done. Okay, well seriously though, let's talk about the various issues, and just to introduce you to the video, I'll talk about what the issues are. So, number one, I'm going to talk about the PvE Patch Cycle. That's probably the longest point, then the PvP Patch Cycle. Some interesting hijinks about the art team, big features, new dungeons, new zones, and then finally, how could they do it in terms of production, and the money side of things, because we all get worried about too much money being extracted from our wallets. It's not fun when that happens. Okay, so first of all, let's talk about the PvE Patch Cycle in a sort of ecosystem where we have a year-long expansion. So first of all, if Blizzard were to do yearly expansions, then we would have to cut out a raid tier and only have 2 per expansion. Why? Well, because 3 tiers in a year is bloody insane. Now, you could do this by having 3 smaller tiers, but then you'd just run into this problem of having to gear people up really quickly and then replace that gear really quickly again, and it would mean that we essentially wouldn't get any of those nice little small patches like, say, 5.1, and that a lot of people actually get great enjoyment out of. So I'd rather just have 2 large tiers of the full-on, like, you know, well-done gear system and all that. However, there is a big problem with this. Having your gear reset by an expansion every year would kind of hurt the desire to raid for some people, especially in that final tier. Plus, having a 2-tier gear progression throughout an expansion may not feel like as much of a journey to some people, so that's a little bit of a problem. Now, they could balance this out by having your raid gear essentially be the equivalent of max level questing gear in the final zone of the new expansion. So I guess that would get around the problem, but it could be at the expense of having a nice power hike from expansion to expansion within those leveling zones. That said though, do raiders really care about that power hike within the questing zones? I don't particularly think so, and hell, it might even help them keep the old number bloat down. So for the sake of argument, let's just say they found a way to fix up that gear problem. What other issues could there be with 2 tiers per expansion? Well, story-wise, it would mean we'd lose out on that second wacky tier. You know, generally the first tier of the expansion is the problems of the world and various things like that. Then the final tier is killing the big bad dude and, you know, having our big victory party. Well, the middle patch is usually, at least in many cases, the really interesting one, where we get something that's a little bit more unique. So Ulduar and Throne of Thunder and things like that have got a completely different art palette, different end boss, a bit of a different story. You know, we would miss out on that, unfortunately, if there was a 2-tier per expansion thing, because story-wise, they would have to start off the expansion and then they'd have to finish the expansion with the end boss. So that would just be a thing that we would miss. And honestly, in an expansion system like this, we would definitely have our expansions being far more focused on one storyline than we have previously. Now, in terms of gear rewards, it could have a little bit of a benefit actually, having a 2-tier system. Essentially, it would mean that heroic dungeons would be relevant for longer. I mean, hell, in the 2nd tier they could release a few harder difficulty dungeons, or perhaps just add in a mythic difficulty. This would get rid of the item level problems that happened in Mists of Pandaria that eventually led to Blizzard resetting our base item level to 496 with the Timeless Isle. So that certainly is another potential kind of benefit we could have here. Now, there are 2 ways of pacing out the content within these patches. So A, in between raid patches you would just have your equivalent of 5.1, so something that's got some new PvE content, maybe new island to explore, just cool things like that. So you'd have your launch tier, then 3 months later you'd have a chilled out interim PvE patch that advances the story. Then you'd have your final raid tier, and then perhaps a few months after that, you would have a PvE story patch that closes out the expansion. Now that is okay, but having the story end at the final, after the final tier would be really bizarre. Perhaps they could just make that second kind of mid, interim little patch thingy lead into the next expansion, so perhaps it could be, say, a beefed up Hallion patch or something like that, that's got a lot of content, but honestly, I think it would still feel rather odd, having the final patch not be the final raid tier. So I think that's a little bit problematic. Oh, plus also having a final small patch and then the next expansion's pre-patch would be a little bit odd, so let's not do that. I think it could be better just to have your first tier, then 2 interim patches 2 months apart, and then 2 or 3 months after that final interim patch, you have the final raid tier of the expansion, which is explicitly designed to last for 6 months. Now that final raid tier would have a bit of robust solo PvE content and all that stuff, so it would certainly last the 6 months. Now this would actually be an extremely good thing to do in terms of player retention. You'd have this extremely agile approach to the first half of the expansion, which would always keep people busy, because not only would you have lots of content to keep up with, but since there's a new smaller patch coming out every 2 months, you've constantly got something to be excited about. Now that could really just do wonders for player retention. And then when you get into that final 6-month-long tier, what you're going to have is, first of all, a really nice, robust patch, but then the hype for the next expansion and that expansion's pre-patch would keep people in the game. So in terms of the actual player retention, this second option would be far and away better than what we have at the minute. Because I think that really Mists of Pandaria did a pretty piss-poor job with 5.0, and I suppose by extension a little bit with 5.1, but you see the period of time between 5.2, 5.3, and 5.4, they did a absolute bang-up job of keeping people retained to the game. In fact, we even had the first subscriber increase that we had had in a very long time. Of course, all those gains are now completely just, flushed down the toilet because, Year of Siege of Orgrimmar. Ugh. Now, there are probably other ways to do this whole patch cycle thing, but they're just the 2 kind of plans that I came up with. So that's basically it in terms of what I would suggest for the PvE stuff. Now, for the PvP side of things. So, we go with one of those patch cycles that I talked about previously, but what we would do is essentially have 2 PvP seasons throughout the expansion, and then I would have it so that the second raid tier of the expansion comes with a significant part, or a significant bit of PvP content. Since the expansion would launch with a new PvP sort of thing, like maybe Ashran or a few new battlegrounds or whatever, then I think that the midpoint of the expansion would be a great time to add some more PvP content in there. Now, I'm not exactly sure what sort of thing you would add. I am not a main, PvPer, I do it from time to time, but I certainly do think that PvP players deserve more content than what they currently get during the patch cycles for the game. I don't think that a new tier, or a new season even, is enough. So perhaps maybe 2 new battlegrounds or something like that. Though, of course, you do run into the problem where, obviously, if you have so many battlegrounds, if you have 20 of them, it's just going to feel a bit strange. But I suppose the more content, the merrier to some people. I'm not 100% sure, but that's something for the real hardcore PvP people to discuss in the comments of this video. Alright then, now that we've talked about patch cycles, let's talk about the art team. So a big thing that Blizzard always talks about is art team resources. Now, for example, the reason why the Timeless Isle looks like the Jade Forest is because the art team was busy with the next expansion, so they just got a few of their environmental artists to just whip up the Timeless Isle out of Jade Forest assets. Now that was fine, I think it worked out okay. I suppose we were all used to the theme of Pandaria, and having a little bit more of that was totally fine. And, of course, something like, say, patch 5.2 would have taken a lot of resources from the art team. So by scrapping the mid-expansion raid tier, and the really expensive one in terms of art assets, basically they would free up the art team to work more on the new raids, dungeons, and zones of subsequent expansions. Now what this would actually mean is that, art assets wise, each expansion would of course be significantly different from the previous one. However, within that expansion, you would have kind of more repeating assets and things like that, so yeah, you know what I mean, basically. You wouldn't have that crazy ass tier in the middle that looks completely different. In general, I'm okay with that. While I do really appreciate new aesthetics, I of course just want more raw content, and having an agile patch system and new expansion every year I think would certainly accomplish that goal. Now another potential issue is big features. Now what do I mean when I say big features? Well, I mean big patch features, things like, say, Flex and Proving Grounds, and then of course the big expansion features like Path of the Titans, the Dance Studio, and Garrisons. Of course, only one of those actually made it into the expansion, but whatever. And I suppose Ashran, Wintergrasp, etc., they all count as well. But anyway, what would happen to big features in an environment where there's an expansion coming out every year? Well, first of all, anything like flex and proving grounds and those kind of little new features that come with patches would just have to be rolled into the next expansion. I just think that from a production standpoint, that's most likely the best way to do it. And you know what? I'm okay with this in general. Personally, I see the sub fee as a means of getting new content that is on par in terms of features with what we currently have. And then the expansion fee is kind of what you pay for the bump up in features and stuff like that. I mean, okay, look, it is a pretty expensive way to play a game, but I'd rather play the game that I enjoy for more money than play some sort of free-to-play game that I don't enjoy as much. However, there's one thing that I would be worried about though, and that is that perhaps instead of a massive new expansion feature like Ashran or, say, the garrisons, we would get something more akin to a smaller mid-expansion feature. So that would be like one of the new features in Warlords being flexed raids instead of a fully implemented garrisons system or something like that. So I'd say that what would likely happen is you would have a bit of a TikTok style sort of thing in terms of the big features. Now, if you don't know what I mean by TikTok, I'm actually harkening back to the way that Intel, the processor company, do their processors. Now, the way that works is they kind of have the big new jazz every 2 years, and then in between that, every year in between those two big sort of talks, you have a little tick, and that little tick basically is just an upgrade to what we previously had. So you would have a garrison style feature coming in every second expansion, and then just smaller, more incremental sort of new features coming in every other expansion. I don't know how I'd feel about all that, we just have to see how it would pan out though. Okay then, new dungeons. So this is something that we all love, and unfortunately it's something that I don't think they've been catering to very well, even with expansions that have a 2-year dev cycle. Of course, more than 2 years. They obviously would have started pre-production before Pandaria launched on Draenor. Anyway, so if there were to be a yearly expansion system, then dungeons would actually be very useful, because if there's only 2 tiers, then dungeons can be basically useful for the duration of the expansion, meaning they would need a solid lineup of dungeons, and this could be done rather easily. Back in the day, right, each tile set, so for an example, Ulduar, Utgard Keep, or Hellfire Citadel, would actually have 2 to 3 dungeons. So in Ulduar you had the Halls of Stone, I think the Halls of Lightning, then some other one. Now, the way they're doing dungeons currently, we would just have the one Ulduar style dungeon. So if they were to just do this yearly expansion thing, then I would say make multiple dungeons per tile set. I think that's the best way to have more dungeons at a low resource cost. I mean, hell, guys, I even liked the old way of doing it because it made places like Ulduar, Tempest Keep, Auchindoun, and Hellfire Citadel feel even larger. They were not just one dungeon. They were a series of adventures that in some cases even got progressively more difficult. I thought that was really awesome, and it was certainly great for just beefing up the number of dungeons available at the launch of an expansion. Okay, then another topic to talk about is new zones, right? So based on what Blizzard have said about Warlords of Draenor and my beta experience, what I can say is that leveling's actually really fast. So they could still have a full amount of zones and fast leveling, basically. Now I would not want a return to a 5-level system, not even with yearly expansions. I could see how people would like that, however, I want fast leveling going up, 10 levels because that actually feels extremely rewarding to play through, and I would want just as many new zones as we are getting in Warlords of Draenor. Do I think that's possible? Yeah, I do actually. With there being no 5.2 patch and things like that, there is more time for the art team to work on ahead at these new zones, but I do think it's really important that every expansion has got a really solid amount of zones. Like, if we start getting 4-zone expansions, I would just start to get very miffed at the whole thing. Okay, so that's really new zones covered. Time to talk about just could they do it from a production standpoint? Well, so far delays have, as far as I can tell, been due to production issues really. So stuff like perhaps them redesigning garrisons and sort of flitting between various designs and things like that. Now, that's the kind of thing that they would just have to internally clear up. I'd imagine that Warlords of Draenor has been a ginormous kick in the stomach to them when it comes to, this issue. I think they'll be a lot more on game. Okay, they already missed, say, Flying Combat and the Dance Studio in Wrath. They missed Path of the Titans in Cataclysm. They probably, well, they didn't miss garrisons, but they had some issues with the garrison design in Draenor, which have really seemed just to have led to a really large delay in the expansion's release. Blizzard better have learned their lesson, and they are actually hiring more staff from what we know, so I think that those production issues would perhaps not be as much of an issue in the future. Now, art-wise, they are increasing the art team, and then of course dropping out that art-intensive mid-expansion raid tier would free up a lot of time, so I think that the art team could absolutely pull it off. Also, remember that for Warlords of Draenor, the art team had to work on both the new models and the garrisons. They were two extremely work-intensive tasks for not only the texture artists, but also for the animation rigging people, the people who actually do the animations themselves, and all that stuff. So it was extremely expensive, and now that that is done, hopefully it's done, and all we will have on garrisons from expansion to an expansion is perhaps some sort of incremental upgrade or something like that. I'm not 100% sure how they will carry that forth though. Anyway, so another thing about Warlords of Draenor is that it really had a very big major class design hurdle. We had the ability prune. Now we won't have that happening again for at least quite a while, so I'd imagine that the time to balance out the classes in subsequent expansions will be reduced. That should definitely help out the systems team quite a bit. You know what, actually, Warlords of Draenor really had a lot of resource-intensive tasks that are secondary to the core raiding and PvP content and gameplay that World of Warcraft is based on. You know, things like, say, the garrisons and the new models are certainly nice, but they're not the core thing that we log in and really do every day with our friends. They just aren't. So now that all those things are done, I think it could work out better for subsequent expansions. Also, a benefit of quicker expansions is that it could lead to a more agile development cycle within Blizzard, which could lead to more rapid iteration, and also just to a more efficient work schedule. That could happen, though I'd imagine that Blizzard are probably working... You know what, they probably are on an agile development cycle at the minute. I'd say that does make sense for a lot of game development projects, though with the size of World of Warcraft, maybe they would need a less agile, more structured system. Anyway, enough about talking about, specific design philosophies, and let's move on to the final topic of this video, and it is money, because money is the kicker. The big thing is, guys, would you be okay with forking over that full box fee twice as much as you currently do, especially keeping in mind that Warlords of Draenor is $10 more than Mists of Pandaria, Cataclysm, and Wrath? That's a big issue. That really is a big issue in terms of the money. You would be paying more. Essentially, your World of Warcraft would cost, what, $50 more a year than it currently does. And while $50 is not a lot to, a lot of people, it's also quite a lot of money to many people. So there's definitely an issue there. And it also would increase the sort of barrier to entry for getting into World of Warcraft. So if they are to do their current style of pricing, then they should basically just keep everything bar the most recent expansion in one box for $5 to $10, with a free month, just to sort of keep the cost of entry to World of Warcraft low. Then expansions ideally would be going back to the Cataclysm or Mists of Pandaria price, not the more expensive Warlords of Draenor price. And then, of course, you would have the free level 90 with, with a new expansion or something like that, just to keep people, interested and give that extra incentive to stimulate growth within the game and hopefully increase the subscriber base. Now, I don't want the game to turn free to play. That's its own video, but suffice to say, nope. And, really, that's really all that there is to say about the issue. I think that they could rework their patch cycle, and if they do that right, then it could lead to the same amount of, or even more new dungeons, plenty new zones, good big features, and they could pull it off. So the question is, guys, what do you think of a system like this? Now, not specifically what I've highlighted in this video, but what do you think of just the idea of yearly expansions for World of Warcraft? I mean, you know what? I think that the just change in pace every year and the sort of overhaul of art could be really interesting. So yeah, that's just what I'm going to throw to you guys. Let me know what you think. Thank you very much for watching this video. You can like, favorite, subscribe, and all that stuff to help out the channel. And I will see you next time.